Hi there. It's time for our turbo review of the equality unit. I will go quickly through each term and I will pause briefly so you can hit pause on your computer. You can come up with your own answer and then hopefully you'll be confirmed by what I say. Okay? Without further ado, here's the review. That was a little poem for you. People. General William Tunner. He was the general who was responsible for the Berlin airlift, saving West Berlin in 1948 and 49. Gail Halvorson. This was the pilot who dropped candy during the Berlin airlift. JFK. This president, even though we remember him because of his assassination, he ruled over a time called Camelot. When I say ruled, it was as if he and his wife were king and queen. And he's known for inspiring the country to ask not what your country can do for you. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was known as a cold warrior, someone who was strong against the Soviet Union, and he was a former actor who charmed the country. Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev changed the Soviet Union, and eventually the Soviet Union broke up because of Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was the supreme leader of the People's Republic of China and gave the order for the crackdown of Tiananmen Square. Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was the first black baseball player in the major leagues, and it was because of Branch Rickey who helped him play for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Harry Truman. Harry Truman is known for his saying, "The buck stops here." He was a fighter against communism, but unfortunately, he was unpopular with many people because he desegregated the military. Adam Clayton Powell. Adam Clayton Powell was a congressman from from Harlem, and he was known for passing bills that helped people in poverty and also with desegregation, but he was a little bit controversial too. Linda Carroll Brown and Oliver Brown. These were the plaintiffs, the ones who brought the case of Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas in 1954. Thurgood Marshall. This is the lawyer brought by the NAACP to help the Brown family in that case. Little Rock 9. These are the 9 students that entered Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas with federal protection. Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was a first grader who entered school in New Orleans. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks led the idea of not wanting to be segregated on buses, and it led to the Montgomery Bus Boycott. MLK. This is Martin Luther King Jr., one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, and obviously he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, and he was assassinated in 1968. Orval Faubus. Orval Faubus was the governor of Arkansas during the Central High crisis, and he believed in massive resistance against forced integration by the federal government. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a Republican who was strong against communism. He associated with Joseph McCarthy at the beginning of his presidency, but by the end of his time, he realized that the military-industrial complex, the partnership between the military and industry, was a very dangerous situation and could lead to the Third World War. George Wallace. The governor of Alabama, who stood in the school door, keeping black students out of the University of Alabama, and he refused to protect people who were fighting for civil rights in Selma. Freedom riders. These are people black and white people who rode interstate buses to defy the segregation laws in the South. Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali is famous as a boxer, but he also defied the draft to the Vietnam War because he believed it was discriminating against African Americans. Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who was murdered by two men in the South when he was accused of whistling at a shopkeeper, and her husband and his brother killed Emmett Till. And his mother, Emmett Till, had an open coffin to make sure everyone knew what had happened. Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was a member of the NAACP, an officer in that organization, and he applied to law school at the University of Mississippi, but eventually was assassinated. James Reeb. James Reeb was a white supporter of the Selma movement, and unfortunately, he was murdered and was a casualty of the civil rights movement. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. These were the three workers who were promoting voter registration, and this led to what was called Mississippi Burning. They were later discovered to have been murdered, and the movie made from that incident was called Mississippi Burning. J. Edgar Hoover, the leader of the FBI for nearly 50 years. He shaped policy. He also created the program COINTELPRO, which was really about spying on American citizens without any cause. And he was against communism. J.D. Rockefeller, one of the richest men in America. He was targeted by anarchists and during the Red Scare, and it mirrors what's happening today when important figures are targeted by terrorists. J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was responsible for creating Chase Manhattan Bank, but he was also targeted by anarchists with a mail bomb. Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers was a confessed spy, but he actually gave testimony against Alger Hiss, and as a result, Chambers never served any time in prison, and Hiss did, and so it seems like maybe he wasn't telling the truth. We're not sure. Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, who started the House Un-American Activities Committee and tried to find communists in government, but basically was a grandstander and was trying to get publicity for himself. J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was responsible for the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb, but eventually he was brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and his reputation was ruined in many ways. Alger Hiss, a diplomat for the State Department. He was accused of being a spy, and Whittaker Chambers said he was working together with Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was the one who was really held responsible, and he denied that he was a spy until his death. Joseph and Ethel Rosenberg. This is a couple who was convicted of spying. Actually, it was their brother. It was Ethel Rosenberg's brother working for the Manhattan Project, but who was the spy, most likely, getting information about atomic bombs. And the thing is, we know that the Rosenbergs probably were involved in some way, and they were executed. David Greenglass. Greenglass was the one who did have communist inclinations, and he gave secrets for the atomic bomb while working at Los Alamos on the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs. This is a German immigrant who was working for the British mission on the Manhattan Project, and he was also guilty of spying, and there's a lot of evidence that he did do that, especially during the war. Gary Powers. Gary Powers was the pilot of the U-2 plane that was shot down over the Soviet Union. He was held prisoner for 2 years, but eventually he was released. It was a huge crisis at the end of Eisenhower's presidency. Fidel Castro. Castro took power in 1959 in Cuba. He was a leftist, a communist, and sided with the Soviet Union. And President Kennedy tried to have him removed using the CIA and also the Bay of Pigs invasion. Leftists. Leftists are generally communists. If you're right, you're conservative. If you're left, you're liberal, and communist is the very, very left. Nikita Khrushchev. This is the leader of the Soviet Union during the most volatile time of the Cold War, and he was prone to outbursts, like picking up his shoe and saying that he would bury the United States. Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald is the only person convicted of assassinating JFK, although there are all kinds of conspiracy theories, considering Oswald himself was murdered by Jack Ruby. Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev was the leader of the Soviet Union after he got rid of Khrushchev, and then eventually he established détente, which is kind of a better relationship with the US during the 1970s. Gerald Ford. Ford took over for Nixon, pardoned Nixon, and then was a part of that process of détente with Brezhnev. Ronald Reagan. We've already said Ronald Reagan was a Cold Warrior. Sorry, I have him twice. Yuri Andropov. Yuri Andropov took over after Brezhnev and was a hardliner. In 1982, he made it feel like it was the 1950s and that the Cold War was getting worse. And so the world was on edge during that time. Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was the mayor of Moscow, and he eventually became president of the new Russian Federation after the fall of the Soviet Union. He was not a communist and he went against the leadership of the country and was very popular because of that. Vladimir Putin. Putin was the heir to Yeltsin, but was very different. He was the former head of the KGB, Russia's spy agency, and now he is the current president of Russia, and he is more of a dictator than a democratically elected president. Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem founded the magazine Ms., which was a magazine for women that gave women more prominence and shared their political views. Billie Jean King. Billie Jean King was a tennis player who was part of the Battle of the Sexes, fighting against Bobby Riggs, and she beat him. And it was a big blow for women's rights. Oglala Sioux. The Oglala Sioux took over Wounded Knee in 1973 in the second Wounded Knee episode, and again they were fighting against this the lack of rights for Native Americans in U.S. society. Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was the leader of the Lakota Sioux, and eventually he knew that the Native Americans had lost the war. He became a part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, but eventually he went back to Wounded Knee, and he was killed during this time of the second Wounded Knee episode. I'm sorry, that was the first Wounded Knee episode, not in 1973. My fault. It was back at the first Wounded Knee episode. Chicanos and Latinos. This is the name of the group of Hispanic Americans who were fighting for rights during the 1960s, 1970s, and fighting to be accepted, even though that they were doing the hardest jobs in the United States. They received very little recognition and had few rights, especially because of language barriers. Cesar Chavez. Chavez organized farm workers into a union, and as a result, wages and conditions improved for primarily Latino farm workers. LBJ is Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he was the vice president to Kennedy, took over when Kennedy was assassinated, and he was responsible for the Great Society and the war on poverty. And so he became quite an activist, very much like FDR. Helen Keller. Helen Keller, you know, was blind and deaf, and yet she was quite a scholar, and she was able to be a leader. She helped to start the ACLU. Beatniks, Beat Generation. After World War II, there was a countercultural group that basically was tired of war and was wanting to do things differently from the traditional way, especially the way that was being accepted all over the country in the 1950s. They were counterculture, and were a preview of the hippies. Hippies, sometimes called flower children. The hippies were resisting the Vietnam War and also just culture in general, and the idea of capitalism being the only way. And the Summer of Love is the primary event for the hippies in Woodstock. Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a leader of a different type within the civil rights movement. As opposed to Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X felt that freedom and equality should be gained by any means necessary, which meant even violence. Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan basically was the heir to Malcolm X. He currently does lead, he's a leader in the Nation of Islam, but he's also very controversial and probably anti-Semitic, says many things against Jewish people. Places. Berlin. Berlin, during the Cold War, after World War II, was divided into two sections, East and West. The eastern section was the Soviet sector that had been occupied by Soviet troops, and it was communist, and the West was capitalist, and there eventually would be a wall built between East and West Berlin. Berlin was actually inside of East Germany. Louisiana. Louisiana was known for its harsh segregation and created laws that led to the Plessy versus Ferguson challenge, but then basically the segregation in the South was confirmed. The policy of separate but equal was confirmed, and that lasted 60 years. East Germany. East Germany was communist, and the Soviets controlled East Germany more or less, and they refused to allow people to go from East Germany to West Germany. West Germany. West Germany is the Federal Republic of Germany, and was comprised of the three other sectors, the French, British, and American sectors, and became a thriving capitalist country after the war. South China Sea. The South China Sea is to the south of China, but it's a controversial area because of the small islands there and the fact that China is now building up those islands and claiming them, even though other countries like Vietnam and the Philippines also claim those islands. South Africa. South Africa was a place that had been divided by apartheid, and South Africa then experienced a kind of peaceful revolution and the black majority was able to control the country and elected Nelson Mandela as the president. Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri was the location really where Black Lives Matter started because of a shooting of a black young man by a white police officer, and the outrage that followed led to further demonstrations and protests. Cape Town. Cape Town has been facing a drought, and there is a lot of danger in that city that it could run out of water if there is another drought. And it's in South Africa and has been a location of tension, obviously, because of apartheid. There were many boycotts in Cape Town because of apartheid. Bands, rock bands, wouldn't play music there. They wouldn't give concerts in Cape Town because of apartheid. Harlem. Harlem was the section of Manhattan where many African Americans settled and created a culture for the United States. Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery was the place where the bus boycott with Rosa Parks, where that took place. Greensboro, North Carolina. Greensboro was the location of the Woolworth lunch counter sit-ins. The Greensboro four men challenged that lunch counter policy. Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham is where, again, Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting against segregation and using peaceful resistance like sit-ins, and he was arrested, and he wrote a letter there in prison. And so his letter in Birmingham jail was very famous for putting forward the idea of nonviolence. Los Alamos, New Mexico. This was the location of the Manhattan Project, creating the atomic bomb. Dallas, Texas. This is where JFK was assassinated. Budapest. Budapest is the capital of Hungary, and during 1956, there was an uprising there, and it was a kind of hope that communism could be overthrown, but eventually it was put down by Russian tanks and troops. Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and it led to a world crisis and eventually an Olympic boycott by the United States and its allies. Moscow. Moscow is obviously the capital of the Soviet Union, and that's where the Kremlin, basically the government buildings are. Lake Placid, New York. Lake Placid was the site of the 1980 Winter Games and what was called the Miracle on Ice, when the U.S. hockey team defeated the Soviet hockey team. Prague. Prague in 1968 was the site of another uprising against communism, led by student protests. It was eventually put down and faded. Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Wounded Knee, again, was the site of the first massacre in the 1800s, and we talked about Sitting Bull during that time. But then in 1973, there was a second Wounded Knee incident, and members of AIM, American Indian Movement, they took over the town to protest leadership problems and basically the lack of good conditions on reservations. Yucca Mountain, Nevada. Yucca Mountain is a potential site for the disposal of radioactive waste, but it's seen by Native Americans as being a sacred site, and so there's tension. Things. The Berlin Wall Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was established in 1961, and it came about because many people were leaving East Berlin for a better life in West Berlin, and the Soviet government and the East German government decided they had to put up a wall to keep people in. Segregation. Segregation is the separation of people, often by race. Separate but equal. This is the policy established by Plessy v. Ferguson, and it was shown to be incorrect by Brown versus the Board of Education. Poll tax. This is a tax on people, giving them the right to vote. People who had fathers or grandfathers who had voted were free of the tax, but that meant that Black people had to pay the tax and they couldn't afford it, and so they didn't vote. Grandfather clause. The grandfather clause was generally for white voters who had fathers or grandfathers who were eligible to vote. Eastern Bloc. The Eastern Bloc is a group of communist countries who joined together to oppose NATO. Iron Curtain. This is a phrase created by Winston Churchill. It's basically the idea that Eastern Europe and Western Europe are separate because of communism in the East. Marshall Plan. General George Marshall came up with a plan for rebuilding Europe, primarily so that it wouldn't descend into anarchy and that so that Western Europe would not fall to communism. Fifth column. The fifth column is the idea that you can have people who look like you in your backyard, next door neighbors, and they can be spies or soldiers for another country, an enemy. NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was established in Western Europe and included the United States, and it defended Western Europe against communism. Warsaw Pact. This is the name of the agreement that created the Eastern Bloc. So Eastern Bloc is more of an affiliation. Warsaw Pact is actually a treaty, just like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. CIA. This is a Central Intelligence Agency. This is the group that is basically spies for the US government going to other countries to gather information. KGB. This is the Russian spy organization, the counterpart to the CIA. Checkpoint Charlie. This is basically the departure point from West Berlin to East Berlin. It was that was the nickname given to it, that it was the gate that you go through to get from East Berlin to West Berlin. One China policy. This is a policy promoted mainly by the People's Republic of China, but was agreed on by the government of Taiwan simply to establish that there could be progress and business partnerships, even if there were two parts to this China. People today in Taiwan believe there are actually two Chinas, not one. And actually it's one China, one Taiwan that they would say. Invictus. Invictus was a story, a movie about the South African rugby team winning the championship and basically uniting the country under Nelson Mandela and in this new era of after apartheid. De facto segregation. De facto segregation is, even though there are no laws, there are traditions keeping Black people and white people apart. NAACP. This is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, colored people, and this was connected to W.E.B. Du Bois, but mainly the idea was to fight for the rights using the justice system, fight for the rights of Black people. Integration. This is bringing together Black people and white people in the same place, especially in schools. Civil disobedience. This is the idea that you can resist without using violence, but also it's the idea that you go against the law when the law is not right. Massive resistance. Massive resistance was the Southern response to the government saying that schools needed to be integrated, and massive resistance was a different kind of resistance against desegregation. National Guard. The National Guard is state militias. They are soldiers commanded by the governor, but they can be made to be a part of the U.S. Army if the president declares that. CORE. This is basically a political activist group of African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement that primarily wanted to get people registered to vote. Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is basically a group of pastors organized by Martin Luther King Jr. at Ebenezer Church in Atlanta, and then it continued to have leadership through the Civil Rights Movement. KKK. This is the Ku Klux Klan, obviously a racist organization that came about after the Civil War, trying to restore Southerners' idea of what they believed was right and putting Black people in a lower place. Letter from Birmingham Jail. This was written by Martin Luther King Jr., again, to speak to the critics of those who thought that Black people were making too much trouble with the Civil Rights Movement. He said that, injustice anywhere is a problem everywhere, right? Mountaintop Speech. The Mountaintop Speech was a speech that MLK gave the night before he was assassinated, and basically he believed he was like Moses and may not reach the promised land. He had some feeling that he might be assassinated or might die. McCarthyism. McCarthyism is connected to Joseph McCarthy and was an effort to find communists, especially within the government and the military. HUAC, H-U-A-C. This is the House Un-American Activities Committee led by Joseph McCarthy to find communists in the government. The Crucible. The Crucible was written by Arthur Miller. It was a play about the Salem witch trials, and it was supposed to echo the idea of a witch hunt in the government. COINTELPRO. This is a program in the government that used wiretapping and break-ins in order to find communists, and led by J. Edgar Hoover. Military-industrial complex. This is a phrase that was basically created by President Eisenhower to describe the partnership between the military and industry in making weapons and needing to make weapons, and then maybe causing war as a result. New Frontier. These are the programs planned by JFK. He didn't achieve many of his goals, but he laid the groundwork for Lyndon Baines Johnson. Great Society. The Great Society picks up the New Frontier and it made it reality by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other acts. Sputnik. Sputnik was the first satellite ever launched into space by the Soviet Union, and the United States was very frightened by this and had to try and catch up. Détente. Détente was an easing of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, especially during the 1970s. Evil Empire. The Evil Empire was President Reagan's reference to the Soviet Union and was trying to show everybody that the Soviet Union hadn't changed and was getting worse. Glasnost. Glasnost is an openness that basically leads to more representation of people, and it was Gorbachev's idea in the Soviet Union. It basically led to the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's a very positive thing, giving people more freedom. Perestroika. Perestroika was a an economic program, not full capitalism, but allowing some private ownership. It eventually, again, led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Oligarchy. Oligarchy is when a group of business people or powerful people lead the country together. It's not a monarchy. It's a rule by a group. Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed by Alice Paul in the 1920s, but it took until the 1970s before there was momentum. It was never ratified by enough states to become an amendment to the Constitution. The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique was written by Betty Friedan, and it basically tried to show that women's place in society was not what Sigmund Freud thought, and that women should have more opportunities. National Organization for Women. National Organization for Women now was created by Betty Friedan and in 1966 and promoted the Equal Rights Amendment and other changes so that women could have equality. AIM. AIM is the American Indian Movement, and again, we've talked about how it was involved in the Wounded Knee episode in 1973, but promoting Native American rights. Limited sovereignty. Reservations in the United States have limited sovereignty. That means sovereignty means that they can decide for themselves what laws they have within the United States government framework. And so it's not that they can do whatever they want or be a separate country. United Fruit Company. This is a large multinational corporation, maybe one of the first global corporations that imported tropical fruit to the United States, but abused its workers in other countries and bribed leaders to have monopolies over the tropical fruit products. Quotas. Quotas are set numbers of people who are admitted to a university or placed in a company, and this was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court. Affirmative action. Affirmative action is the programs and the proposals by the government to get better, more equal representation of different minority groups in the United States. It is constitutional for universities to consider race in their admissions process. War on poverty. The war on poverty was proposed by Lyndon Johnson, and it basically was a part of his Great Society programs. Medicare. Medicare was maybe LBJ's greatest achievement, getting health care for the elderly in the United States. Tea Party. This is a movement that became quite strong in the late 2000s and then about 2010, and it led to great political change, especially within the Republican Party in the United States. ACLU. The ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, and this is fighting for rights and freedoms, and it's seen as a very liberal group, fighting against any sort of conservative social programs or the taking away of freedom. And there are many lawyers connected to the ACLU. NRA. The NRA is an organization that fights for the conservative right to bear arms, trying to maintain that part of the Constitution. PAC. A PAC is a political action committee and can support any political view. Basically, PACs work for a political party, but there are laws against the PAC raising money directly for a candidate for office, and so they have to just be parallel and support the ideas of the candidate. Black Power movement. The Black Power movement came about through people like Malcolm X and others who were frustrated with the pace of reform in civil rights. The Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were a semi-militant organization in the United States who believed that civil disobedience involved violence if necessary. Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was again connected to Malcolm X and also Louis Farrakhan, and it's a Muslim organization for African Americans, and you will often see Nation of Islam members in security functions. Events. The Berlin airlift and blockade. This happened in 1948 and 49. Stalin closed the corridor into East Germany that led to Berlin, and basically was trying to starve West Berlin and make it communist. And the Western European countries supported saving West Berlin by sending food, one flight after another. Kennedy's Berlin Wall speech. In 1961, after the wall was built, Kennedy visited Berlin and gave a rousing speech saying, "I am a Berliner." But when he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," he actually was saying, "I am a jelly donut." But the main thing is that people of West Berlin loved him and loved the fact that America was supporting Germany, supporting West Germany and West Berlin. Executive Order 9981. This is the order, the executive order by which Harry Truman desegregated the military. So it was a major move in integrating Americans. Brown v. Board of Education. We've talked about the Brown family wanting their daughter to go to school in a white school, and Thurgood Marshall defended the case. Eventually, it was a landmark case in 1954 that led to the integration of all schools in the United States. Montgomery Bus Boycott. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat for a white person, the Montgomery Bus Boycott lasted for a year and a half, and it devastated the bus companies, and they finally gave in, and buses were integrated. Woolworth lunch counter sit-ins. The Greensboro Four started this, and others followed the next day. And even though there was incredible pressure for them to give in, they sustained their sit-ins, and eventually Woolworth, because of the loss of revenue, they gave in and they integrated their lunch counters. School door stand. Governor George Wallace of Alabama refused to admit Black students into the University of Alabama. Eventually, he was forced to stand down, and he would also, eventually, he would take back his ideas of fighting against integration, and it seems like he was repentant, and he actually ran for president. He was shot while he was running for president, and he was paralyzed from that point forward. Executive Order 11111. This is Kennedy's order nationalizing the National Guard, federalizing the National Guard in Alabama so that the University of Alabama would be integrated. Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was a period of voter registration in the South. Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was passed by LBJ after Kennedy was assassinated because he knew that people were very emotional about that loss, and he was able to push forward that very important Civil Rights Act in honor of JFK. Voting Rights Act of 1965. Because people had ignored laws previously, it was necessary to pass this additional act and make sure that Black people could register to vote without the poll taxes. Cleveland Summit. This is a nickname for the meeting that Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, organized with other Black athletes opposing the Vietnam War and the draft. Bloody Sunday. This was the first march from Selma to Montgomery, and when they got to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the protesters, the Black marchers were beaten, and one woman was beaten unconscious and left on the bridge, and that made the whole nation realize they couldn't ignore this situation. March to Montgomery. This is, again, the march from Selma to Montgomery to petition for equal treatment, especially with voter registration. March on Washington. This is the famous march in 1963, August 1963, when MLK gave his I Have a Dream speech. And there were hundreds of thousands of people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. Members of the KKK planted a bomb in a church, and it killed 4 little girls. Assassination of MLK. After his Mountaintop Speech, MLK was assassinated the next day, and the country was in mourning. Assassination of RFK. This also took place in 1968, just a few months later, after he had won the California primary and was giving a speech in a California hotel, Los Angeles hotel. He was shot at that moment and was killed. Second Red Scare. The Second Red Scare refers to that second period of fighting against communism from 1947 to 1960, much longer, and it impacted culture in the United States as people were afraid of their neighbors and they were afraid that they would be accused themselves. Army McCarthy hearings. These hearings exposed McCarthy for being a fraud because only the one dentist was found to maybe be a communist, but even then he just pleaded the fifth. He didn't say he was a communist. He just pleaded the Fifth Amendment. Election of 2016 and Russian interference. I won't say much about this other than that this is an ongoing investigation of Russia's impact on the election of 2016, apparently trying to help Donald Trump become president, but there are many things that the Soviet Union heir, which is the Russian Federation, there are many things that the Russian Federation wants to do, mainly create chaos in this country. U-2 incident. The U-2 incident was Gary Powers being shot down over the Soviet Union. Eisenhower's farewell address. This is the introduction of the military-industrial complex by Eisenhower at the end of his presidency. Bay of Pigs invasion. This is the invasion of Cuba. Basically, the CIA was supporting rebels, but then there was no air support, and so the revolution failed, and Kennedy got the blame for it. Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis came about because the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba very close to the United States, and as a result, the United States had to challenge the Soviet Union and make them dismantle and take out the missiles. Camelot era. The Camelot era is just referencing JFK's presidency and the idea that it was a golden age and a special time with someone who seemed like a king and a queen from a fairy tale. Space race. The space race was competition to get to the moon and to do other things in space between the US and the Soviet Union. Warren Commission. The Warren Commission was established with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, and it was to find out what had happened with JFK's assassination. East German Uprising of 1953. This happened because of workers in East Germany going on strike, and it was an uprising that was put down. Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Again, you had striking workers and students who were protesting in Budapest, and eventually it was put down by the government. Prague Spring of 1968. This was a student-led uprising in Prague, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and it was put down by the Soviet Union. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This was an attempt by the Soviet Union to support communist rebels against the government, and eventually it led to a long war that the Soviet Union really didn't win. Boycott of 1980 Summer Olympics. This took place because of the invasion of Afghanistan. 1980 Winter Olympics, Miracle on Ice. This was the amazing victory by the US hockey team over the Soviet hockey team. Iran-Contra scandal. President Reagan's administration was selling weapons to Iran to get money to give to South American or Central American rebels in Nicaragua without the government knowing. And when it was exposed, several people were put on trial. Velvet Revolution. This is the name of the uprising in 1989 in Prague and Czechoslovakia, which eventually overthrew the communist government. Second wave feminism. Second wave feminism happened during the 1970s mostly, but you could say it started in 1966 or with Betty Friedan's book in 1963 and 64. Battle of the Sexes. This was the tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. Dawes Act of 1887. This is the act that tried to assimilate Native Americans by selling and dividing up the land of their reservations. Wounded Knee Incident. This is the incident where Native Americans took over the town of Wounded Knee, and they were basically fighting for more rights for Native Americans. Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Signed by President Reagan, this gave Native Americans the power to create casinos on their reservations and make money for healthcare and education. Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This basically kept race out of the idea that people could become citizens, and it abolished quotas, for example, for Asian Americans. Civil Liberties Act of 1988. This was an act that basically apologized for the Japanese internment and tried to make amends for that act against Japanese Americans. Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This was passed to achieve full inclusion of people with special needs in the United States. Student Movement of 1968. This happened on a global level, and there were many student groups all over the world protesting against governments, especially in Paris, where there were leftists who wanted to change the government. Alcatraz occupation. This was an occupation by Native Americans, and they took over that land, claiming that they had a right to it because it was not being used. Woodstock. Woodstock was the concert, the festival in 1969. It was basically in a farmer's backyard and came together, but it was very peaceful. Apollo 13 crisis. The Apollo 13 crisis happened in 1970, and the U.S. successfully brought astronauts back, even though their ship was in distress. Summer of Love. In 1967, hippies converged on San Francisco, and that became known as the Summer of Love, with free clinics and sit-ins and be-ins and music concerts. OPEC Oil Embargo. This happened in response to the Arab-Israeli War in 1973, and the Arab oil-producing countries were basically choking off oil, and it led to high gas prices in the United States. 1980 Summer Olympics boycott. Basically, we have already discussed that. Watts race riots. The race riots happened in 1965 because of police brutality, and there were other riots that came later in Newark and Detroit, but the Watts race riots are what many people remember in Los Angeles. Thank you for watching.